ladies and gentlemen, Nick here, and welcome to my top 10 Third Doctor monsters, villains, creatures, and aliens ranking. So I'm just going to be talking about the top 10 monsters, creatures, aliens, and villains from the Third Doctor's era. Just talking about the Third Doctor's era itself, Spearhead from Space to Planet of the Spiders, any story, any creatures, any monsters, any aliens, and any villains from those stories or that were introduced in that era. I'm not going to be counting ones introduced before that appeared in it, so Daleks and Night Warriors, you're sadly not going to be on this list, although you will be honourable mentions. I should probably say now, sorry for any noise you might hear, the window is open. So, without any further ado, the top 10 Third Doctor monsters, villains, creatures, and aliens. Before we get started, a couple of honourable mentions. First of all, to the Daleks and the Ice Warriors, due to being introduced in the first and second Doctor's eras, respectively. These two can't really be counted as original Third Doctor monsters or villains, although we did get some new designs for the colour schemes for the Daleks introduced in the Third Doctor's era. In Day of the Daleks, we got introduced to the Gold Dalek Task Force leader, as well as the Gunmetal Grey Daleks. That would be a staple of 70s and 80s Dalek designs, pretty much in every Dalek story, apart from Death to the Dalek, up to Revelation, with a lighter grey design with Destiny, although there was at least one dark grey one, maybe. And then Remembrance, we had the Renegade Daleks, which were slightly a lighter grey as well, not as light as Destiny's. Some sort of grey Dalek design to some degree has appeared in every classic series story from Day of the Daleks onwards, apart from Death to the Daleks, where they got kind of a different colour scheme. They were silver and black. That was a pretty interesting design. Shame they didn't have any more of them. And also we got introduced to the Supreme Council Dalek, or the Supreme Dalek of Planet of the Daleks, which was a Dalek movie Dalek, but with jam jars for lights and given a black and gold and green colour scheme. Pretty interesting. As for the Ice Warriors, it was actually interesting to see them as allies in Curse of Peladon before having a rogue group in the Monster of Peladon try to go back to the ways that they were in the Ice Warriors and the Seeds of Death. Other honourable mentions that did not quite make this list include Azal from the Daemons, Agador from the Peladon stories, the Eight Legs from Planet of the Spiders, and the Ogrons from Day of the Daleks and Frontier in Space. Anyway, on to the top 10 itself. Number 10. Drashigs. Appearing in Carnivore of Monsters, these guys will basically just eat anything. They're just there to eat and eat and eat, and they'll crash through different sections of the Visualscope. Can't quite remember what it was, but they'll crash through different sections to get to other places, and they'll eat. A pretty cool design, though. They are they're a puppet, which is also a fun fact. The toy action figure version is also a hand puppet, and it's actually a pretty decent design. It does look like a typical worm creature monster, but it's still pretty impressive to look at. To be honest, most of my love for the Drashigs does come from Drashig from 5 Who fans, but these guys are still really impressive, and it'd be cool to see them back again. They have made the return to Big Finish, but I haven't heard that one yet. Moving on to number 9, a bit more of a memorable monster, the Axons from the Claws of Axos. Interesting monster here. Now, we did get two versions of these. We got the humanoid version that appears as a gold person. Fun fact, Bernard Hofstall, who's a regular Doctor Who guest star, was one of them. And there was 4 of them, make up some sort of family. And then in their natural form, they look like big spaghetti kind of creatures. Although it is still a pretty interesting design for a low-budget spaghetti-style costume. And the fact that they were trying to trick the humans with Axonites, it was supposed to be a gift, but it turned out to be bait for human greed. Pretty interesting, and interesting that they tried to get electricity from electrical power plants. Fun fact, one of the costumes for the Axons was actually reused for the Crinoid in Season 13's The Seeds of Doom, which was in 1976. So roughly 5 years later, and also the Axons have gone on to make a couple of expanded media appearances, such as in Big Finish, with at least one 6th Doctor audio, and an 11th Doctor Doctor Who magazine comic strip series story. But they've not actually returned to TV, and I think they're one of the more popular ones to return to television, along with one that will be mentioned later on. But before that, number 8, the Primoids from Inferno. Now, these guys are probably the most human villains on this list. The closest we're going to get to human villains, although we had plenty of human villains in the Third Doctor's era, such as that one guy, the Doctor, called a Nitwit in Inferno. And the Primoids are sort of mutated humans with this gas or goo coming out from the ground that infects them. The design itself, with they're like a werewolf person, very hairy and lots of hair around their face. It's an interesting design, and it works really well with the story that they're going with the whole environmental side. See, they were doing environmental political messages before the Whittaker era, people. Okay, number 7. These are another monster that fans are wanting to return, and they're very similar to another one that's going to appear on this list later on. Appearing in the Sea Devils, it's the Sea Devils. The Sea Devils, again, are great monsters. They are underwater aquatic lizards from the dawn of time, so to speak. Original inhabitants of planet Earth, along with their land cousins, the Silurians or the Eocene, depending on when they lived, and hiding under the sea and under the surface of the Earth to avoid a giant rock satellite crashing into Earth and causing a catastrophe, wiping out all life on Earth. However, this turned out to be what would become the Moon. And now they want to reclaim their land from the humans. And they're pretty good monsters in the Sea Devils, as well as also their return in Warriors of the Deep. I think this is the first, yeah, these are the first monsters on the list to make a return in another Doctor's era, other than the ones that have already made an appearance. And yeah, I think they're pretty cool monsters. I do prefer their design here than in Warriors of the Deep. They're more their original netting covered shirt things. I actually think that feels more sea-based ones than the Japanese samurai costumes from Warriors of the Deep, even though those look a bit more refined. Is that the word? And less cheap. But I think these ones I think these guys look pretty good. It's a shame they haven't returned in the new series, apart from in archive footage flashbacks like in the 11th hour. It's a shame they could have another story. Speaking of the Silurians, number 6 is the Silurians. Introduced in Doctor Who and the Silurians, which is, fun fact, the only TV story to have Doctor Who and the insert monster name here, or insert some sort of name here. The Target novelizations have those pretty much almost all the time. Maybe later editions stop doing them, but certainly most of the Target novelizations are Doctor Who and the insert title here. And of course, there's the movie Doctor Who and the Daleks. But this is the first TV story, and currently the only TV story, to be called Doctor Who and the insert something here, in this case, the Silurians. The Silurians, I think, are, again, really interesting with having to hide underneath Earth to avoid the collision of what would be the Moon. And I think they're well designed. I do slightly prefer this Warriors of the Deep version this time round, however, a slightly updated one. But I think these original designs still looked really cool. I actually think the best design is from the new series, where they look more humanoid and a bit more relatable. Although they do lose the third eye, which was useful back in this story. I think more useful than in Warriors as well. So, yeah, I think these guys were pretty cool. Moving on to number 5. Number 5 is a nicely designed monster and a very easy to perform one with just a bit of costume and maybe just a mask and some makeup. A more humanoid monster, the Draconians from Frontier in Space. Apparently, these were John Pertwee's favourite monster, as he said in the More Than 30 Years in the TARDIS documentary. And you can see why you can definitely be able to tell their more facial expressions, and the costumes aren't too heavy to put on, I would say, probably not. Known as the Dragons by the humans, these guys have some sort of feud with the humans. They're not really getting along so well. Frontier in Space is a very Cold War-esque story. Warriors of the Deep is as well, but that's Peter Davidson's era. Plus, that's only looking at one side of the war, whilst Frontier in Space shows that both sides are very 50-50, like America and Russia were during the Cold War. Both are yay and both are nay, depending on what they're up to. And in the end, they both come together to battle a third party, trying to get them to go to war. I'm not sure which countries in the real world would want to get Russia and America to actually go to war with each other. In the James Bond film You Only Live Twice, we actually do see a nation hire Spectre, the criminal organisation, to try and get Russia and America at each other's throats Not sure which country it was, though, they never said. So I was wondering which countries would actually benefit or like having Russia and America go to war with each other. I'm pretty sure the answer would be none of them, but I could be wrong about that. And the third party in Frontier in Space could emulate said potential third party. In Frontier's case, it's the Daleks with the Ogrons and the Master on their behalf. But yeah, in real life, not sure who would actually want two nations to go to war, especially with the potential to be a nuclear war. Yep, goodbye Earth, I suppose. The Draconians are actually pretty cool creatures, and they're actually quite nice guys. I suppose maybe they and the humans get a better relationship after the events of Frontier in Space, but we didn't really see the outcome of that. We went straight into Planet of the Daleks, and we didn't really tie up that story. And Malcolm Hulke's next story would be Invasion of the Dinosaurs. And then he wouldn't write for the show again, well, not for the TV series anyway. Maybe it's explained in the Target novelization, but for the TV story, it doesn't get finished up, and that is a disappointment. Moving out of Malcolm Hulke territory and back into Robert Holmes territory, we have number 4. Number 4 is actually two creatures, but they're inseparable. You can't have one without the other. Well, you could have one of them without the other, but the other you can't have without the first one. And that is the Autons and the Nestene. Introduced in Spearhead from Space, returning in Terror of the Autons, and then would, of course, return in Rose and the Pandorica Opens and the Big Bang. The Autons are a really interesting design. They're probably the most down-to-earth villain, at least introduced in the Pertwee era, where they're shop window dummies coming to life, smashing through windows and coming out and killing random people in the streets. Really, really interesting, and made even more effective with the cinematography and the music used in Spearhead from Space and later in Rose in Christopher Eccleston's era. I also think the Nestene is a pretty interesting creature, though I prefer the golden liquidy stuff from Rose. I think that is just a better designed monster than the green squid alien thing from the Pertwee era. But I think it's a pretty interesting creature that can control all plastics. As we see in Terror of the Autons, they can control a lot more plastic than they can. And it's also interesting to see the Autons disguise themselves as stuff like policemen and daffodil sellers in Terror of the Autons and Roman soldiers in the Pandorica Opens and the Big Bang. However, in the case of the former, I do not like the fact that they talk and they have these very genetic, not robotic, but kind of just wobbly voices when they're talking to the Master. It's just doesn't sit right. It works in the Pandorica Opens in the Big Bang because they're perfect replicas of humanoid soldiers with their own thought patterns, and they actually think that they're those people, including Centurion Rory, until the activation signal, and even then Rory's trying to fight that. So yeah, I think it works when they're actually perfect replicas, but when it's plain old Autons, it doesn't quite work that they talk. Just have them do what they do in the streets, or at the very least be the Autons from Spearhead when it's very humanoid faces on them, and that might work. Right then, moving on to number 3, another Robert Holmes created monster, this time coming from the opposite end of the John Pertwee era, and it is of course the Sontarans. Introduced in the Time Warrior, and we got introduced to Lynx. Now, Lynx was a really great villain in the Time Warrior. I also liked Iron Gorg in that story, although he was very shouty and loudy, but he was still a pretty good villain for that story. But Lynx was amazing. He was brilliant, and introduced us to the Sontarans. The Sontarans, as the third Doctor put it, are nasty, brutish, and short, apart from in the two Doctors where they're just nasty and brutish and a bit too tall. But I think the Sontarans are a great monster. They're great in the Lynx is great in the Time Warrior. Then stakes are raised a little bit for the Sontaran experiment. Then the Invasion of Time. They came to invade Gallifrey. Those two stories of Tom Baker. Then we jump to Colin Baker's era for the two Doctors, where they're too tall and not really the focus of that story. But they help Cassini the Androgon, enhanced Androgon, kidnap the second Doctor, so the sixth Doctor has to go and rescue him, and then they come back for the new series story, the Sontaran Stratagem and the Poison Sky, and that is, in my opinion, whilst the two Doctors is my personal favourite story with the Sontarans, like I said, they're not the focus of that one. The Sontaran Stratagem, the Poison Sky, I think is the best Sontaran story to feature the Sontarans as the primary antagonist. Facing against David Tennant's 10th Doctor, they are really at their best in that story, and even a few new things are introduced for that one. Sadly, after the Pandorica Opens the Big Bang, they do become more of a comedic foil. I mean, I'm okay with Strax doing it because he's a one-off character, but the ones in the Time of the Doctor are just silly. So hopefully the Sontarans can return in their full glory like they did in Series 4 and the Sarah Jane Adventures in a later series later down the line. Lynx as an individual character is probably the best classic Sontaran, and probably one of the best Sontarans overall. I do really like the ones from Sontaran, Stratton, Poison Sky, and I do have a soft spot for Strax, and Karg in the Sarah Jane Adventures is pretty good as well. But I think Lynx is a great character in his own right, and definitely introduces us to the Sontarans really well. He's probably also the best designed classic series Sontaran. Lynx was a really great character in the Time Warrior, and he introduced us to a really great monster species. Right, we're dipping out of Robert Holmes territory for this next one for number 2. Number 2 is a pretty interesting villain who's also very powerful and not to be toyed with. Omega from the Three Doctors. I think he's a really good villain. I think he's got some really great stuff going for it. He's also probably the most sympathetic villain on this list, as he feels betrayed by the Time Lords, he feels trapped, they weren't able to help him, and now he's losing himself to the antimatter. He's only keeping his will in order to keep him to survive as well as the world and float, and he can barely return back to the non-antimatter world, into the matter world. And the one time he was given the chance to go back, he thought it was a trick and more or less caused his own demise, well, sort of demise, in the Three Doctors, sadly, when the Doctor actually tried to help him. And then in Arc of Infinity, when he returns, he then goes through some... Actually, I can't quite remember what his plan was. It was a bit daft, and he had this one antimatter creature. He had these gel grooves in Three Doctors, but he had this other guy for Arc of Infinity. It was a bit strange. He's also supposed to be returning in this K9 film, that's K9 Timequake. That's supposed to have been coming up, but I'm not sure what's happening with that anymore. But as for his appearances in the Three Doctors and Arc of Infinity, specifically Three Doctors, because that's the Pertwee one. Arc of Infinity was Davison. I find Stephen Thorne to be a fantastic villain in whichever role he's in. He was Hazal in The Daemons, who I mentioned earlier, and then he goes on to be Eldrad in The Hand of Fear, and both times he's really great. And I think Omega is his best character, and I think it was his best performance, and he was just absolutely amazing. And the character was also really great. There's a reason why people want him to come back as well. And he didn't make one appearance in the TV series, and maybe one or two expanded media ones. He made one in the audio, Omega. Both that and Arc of Infinity had Ian Collider in the role. But alas, I don't think there's been much of Omega. So hopefully he'll have a TV return. Maybe he is the one pulling the strings behind the Whittaker era. We don't know just yet. We'll find out. There might not even be a person pulling the strings behind Whittaker's era, apart from Chris Chibnall. Well, obviously. Finally, we come to number 1. Back to Robert Holmes territory, but what could possibly be number 1? Who could possibly be the best villain, or alien, or creature, or monster from the Jon Pertwee era? Well, if it's not the Daleks, because I can't really count them on this list, because this is ones that appeared for the first time in the Pertwee era, or only in the Pertwee era, and the Daleks appeared in Hartnell and Troughton's era, introduced all the way back in 1963. So, it can't be them, and it can't be the Drashigs, because Drashig from Five Who fans doesn't really count. So the Drashigs, as they were in Carnival Monsters, went 10th, but if I was including Five Who fans Drashigs, he would be number 1. And he's not really a villain, to be honest, actually. But who else could it possibly be? I've said the Sontarans, I've said the Autons, I've said the Silurians, said the Axons, I've said a couple more. Who could possibly be number 1? Who is it? Well, I don't know about you guys, but I know someone who's usually referred to as the Master. Number 1 is, of course, the Master. And you will obey him. The Master is, of course, the best villain, alien, creature, or monster introduced in the Jon Pertwee era, making his first appearance in Terror of the Autons, and then making an appearance in every other story of Season 8, which were the Mind of Evil, the Claws of Axos, which included the Axons, Colony in Space, and he was easily the best thing of that story. That is a terrible story. And the Demons, which I mentioned about with Azal, and that's my personal favourite Pertwee story at the moment. He also appeared in Season 9's The Sea Devils, with the Sea Devils, and the Time Monster, and also in Season 10's Frontier in Space. Roger Delgado was perfect casting as the first TV Master, although he's not the first incarnation of the Master. He's probably closer to being the 12th, to be honest. 11th or 12th, maybe even 13th. But he's still one of the best casting choices of the Master, and probably the best Master. He's just perfect. Designed as the Moriarty to the Doctor's Sherlock Holmes, and an adversary to him, and basically his mirror image in a way. The Master just wants to rule or destroy or conquer, as opposed to the Doctor, who wants to explore and see and witness. And I think they're really great. I also love the chemistry between Jon Pertwee and Roger Delgado. They were close friends in real life. And the fact that the Doctor and the Master used to be friends really shines through with their meetings, helped by the performances of real-life friends Jon Pertwee and Roger Delgado. And it had some really great stuff with him and some really good adventures. Yeah, the Master didn't always have the best of stories, and looking at you, Colony in Space, but he was still a highlight in every single one of them. Sadly, the Delgado's Master's story came to an abrupt end after Roger Delgado passed away in an accident in 1973 whilst filming a film in Turkey, I'm not sure which film, and plans for a final Third Doctor versus Master story for Season 11 were cancelled. I'm wondering if they were going to have any more Master stories in Season 11, not just the final one. The only good thing about that, to come out of that, is the fact that they were going to reveal the Master was going to be the Doctor's brother, which is a terrible idea. But thankfully that didn't happen. But it was sad to see Roger Delgado go, and it was sad that they didn't get any more stories, especially, again, after Frontier in Space. We didn't really see what happened to him. We'd have to wait until The Deadly Assassin to find out what happened to the Master next, and even then, not exactly what happened at the end of the previous story. We had to wait until 1976's The Deadly Assassin to see him again. It was also a shame that he didn't become a stable villain of the Tom Baker era, only appearing in 3 Tom Baker stories, 2 of them the last 2. But thankfully he was a staple villain of the 5th, 6th and 7th Doctor's eras, specifically 5. He also caused some problems for the 8th Doctor, as well as making quite a few appearances in the 10th, 12th and 13th Doctor's eras, especially 12. But the Roger Delgado Master is still my favourite and still probably the best, despite many other Masters coming later down the line. So that's it from me. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time, whatever that might be. Goodbye.